Greetings, good people. I hope that you are very, very well. Welcome to the Paper Plane podcast. I am Colin Masashi Roja Hio Ehara, and the Paper Plane is a podcast created, hosted by myself, where I will be interviewing people I am blessed and honored to share community with. I will be asking them about a book that has had a transformational impact on their lives. And in a society where literacy rates are steadily declining and a growing number of podcasts hosted by cishet men consciously or unconsciously champion expressions of masculinity that come at the expense of women, femmes, and LGBTQIA, Two-Spirit Plus, especially BIPOC folks. This space aims imperfectly, humanly, to operate as a counter narrative to those things. The Paper Plane is a space that intends to highlight the dire importance of relationships, community, dialogue, perpetual learning, honest expression as art, art as honest expression, freedom for literacy, and of course, literacy for freedom. It speaks to planes of existence attached to the act of reading, but also as a metaphor for the quote unquote flights we take as we sit on what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls a one-way interface as readers and how these journeys shape us. Um, Today, my guest, a dear, dear brother of mine, who I had the honor not too long ago of being a groomsman at his wedding. But he goes by the pen name YD Hawkins, and that's how we'll be operating as far as his nomenclature today. I will lovingly be referring to him as D. But YD Hawkins is a Bay Area social worker, thinker, and poet. Over the years, he has served as a union organizer, youth trauma response specialist, mental health case manager for adults with co-occurring disorders. His debut poetry collection, Years Like Fevers, is a document of the labor movement, love, and murder during the Great Recession. It has been described as, quote unquote, you did it by three of the five people who have purchased it. I definitely got my autographed copy. His forthcoming book, Totem, will investigate the commoditized self, quote unquote you, and quote unquote me, as ontological categories needing exorcism. More than anything, YD is a husband to a beautiful wife and father to a daughter who has expanded his life with boundless meaning, something I can powerfully relate to. He looks forward to the arrival of another this coming May, perfectly named Adelasoul. And so I would love to welcome YD Hawkins to the Paper Plane podcast. YD, welcome. How are you doing?
I am doing well, man. Thank you so much for having me. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for being here and super supreme congratulations on welcoming a powerful, beautiful new life into the world in May, which is the month I was born, so I'm very juiced about that.
All right. Okay. That's good omens. Good omens. Yep.
Yeah, but so glad to have you, and also to talk about capital or Das Kapital. And just to quickly jump in with a note for the anyone listening. I have not read this text in its entirety. And throughout this podcast, I will not necessarily be reading every single in its entirety, each text that the different community members that I'm speaking with will be talking about, and in line with thinking about parenthood, fatherhood, with two small children at this point in my life. It has been pretty challenging to read, and have that kind of uninterrupted quiet time. And so I also am someone who commutes about 3 hours a day each time I go out to work. And so a lot of my reading, quote unquote, is done via audiobooks at this particular juncture of my life. And also, looking at, summaries and stuff like that. And so in that very vein, I'm going to read a brief summary, just via Wikipedia, of Capital and Das Kapital. Capital, or Das Kapital, is a foundational theoretical text in materialist philosophy and critique of political economy written by Karl Marx. Published as three volumes in 1867, 1885, and 1894. The culmination of his life's work, the text contains Marx's analysis of capitalism, to which he sought to apply his theory of historical materialism to lay bare the economic law of motion of modern society, following from classical political economists such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo. The text's second and third volumes were completed from Marx's notes after his death and published by his colleague Friedrich Engels. Das Kapital is the most cited book in the social sciences published before the year 1950. Marx's theory of historical materialism posits that the economic structure of society, in particular, the forces and relations of production, are the crucial factors in shaping in nature. Rather than a simple description of capitalism as an economic model, Das Kapital instead examines capitalism as a historical epoch and a mode of production and seeks to trace its origins, development, and decline. Marx argues that capitalism is a form of economic organization which has arisen and developed in a specific historical context and which contains tendencies and contradictions which will inevitably lead to its decline and collapse. Marx considered Das Kapital a scientific work, and in it critiqued both the system and the bourgeois political economists who argue that it is efficient and stable. There's a lot that we're going to be looking at here, but today we're going to be discussing some of these following themes pertaining to this particular work. The intersection of poetry in Marx's capital's relevance to modern labor movements, human value beyond economics and money, the alienation of labor, the role of storytelling in class liberation, challenges of communicating Marx's ideas to workers and or the quote unquote lumpen proletariat, as Huey P. Newton called them, solidarity and social work in capitalist society, and then ultimately imagining life after capitalism, post-capitalism. And so to begin, just to open, I'm curious, D, why you decided on this particular classic text for us to discuss on the paper plane, and also what journey or journeys has it taken you on?
And to be clear to the audience, we're going to be talking about volume one of Capital.
Yes, yes. Thank you for saying. I
Um,
forgot to say that.
yeah. So, um, and I mean, also to your point, I was able to read volume one at a very, yeah, I mean, just one of those like uh historical coincidences that I benefited from. So I had an employer that was able to shut down during the early stages of COVID.
Huh.
And so I was able to be paid my full salary while I was at home uh,
Mm, mm,
with, Miko and my wife. And so capital was my way of like just trying to kind of block out like the flush of panic and whatever else was going on in the social media sphere. Um,
mm,
and obviously, it took me like much longer than the amount of time that I got away from my work duties, but I kept at it. And so the reason why I chose it for the podcast is, I mean, there's been several different books throughout different like eras of my life that have been like really, really important. Like if I was going to bring 13-year-old me or 14-year-old me here, it would be like Parable of the Sower.
mm. Yep.
This is the book that I think is most relevant to the phase that I'm in right now.
Hmm.
And I think it's because it's the era where like I decided to really challenge myself and see if I'm somebody who could actually contend with people who have sort of produced their own signature intellectual and philosophical work. And
Mm,
moreover, if I could actually then um, humbly if I could be somebody who could follow in their tradition and at least be somebody who, if not like a philosopher, if I could actually just do the work in my everyday life, but also in my art, of trying to actively interpret the world according to, um, yeah, I mean, according to the actual philosophy and theoretical models
mm.
of, you know, our heralds, right?
Wow.
Um, I think after 2008, there was sort of like a very vague, um, I won't say vague, but general like anti-capitalist sentiment that arose, right?
Mm,
And that felt
hmm.
very liberating because I mean, 2008 was the first time that I think on television I ever saw a news anchor even acknowledge that capitalism was the system that moved things, that it was the
Yeah,
mode of production, right? Because
sure.
I think, information couldn't be disseminated fast enough to give news anchors their marching orders, so everybody was in
Hmm.
shock. And so I remember an anchor was like, is capitalism circling the drain? Which is very funny to think about 17 years later.
Wow.
So immediately in response, a lot of people seize their moment, and I think actors of varying faith, some good, some bad, um, some in the middle, they decided to use that as a moment to begin discussing the inequalities of capitalism.
Hmm.
And obviously, it's a ground for ripe discussion, for a lot of productive discussion. It's something we should be talking about. What I found, though, a lot of times, and my orientation to that discussion was always as a student. It was always like, oh, tell me what you think. And
Hmm.
love to read that. I would just receive.
Hmm.
And Marx would always be referenced. He would always be brought into the conversation like a talisman, or like an
Hmm.
ancestor, or like a great
Hmm.
spirit that would sanctify the discussion
Hmm.
and sort of confirm that we were all on the correct side of history, and that we were all properly examining things together. But I could never be sure if the conversation was actually rooted in what this dude said, because I was like, I never read Capital.
Hmm.
Like, I was exposed to Marx in college. I was one of those
Yeah.
lucky college kids. So,
Yeah. Same.
uh, so we went to UC Santa Cruz, which had
Hmm.
an intro to Marxism class,
Hmm. Yep.
and a Marxism 102.
Hmm.
Um, and looking back, I mean, those classes I still think were really helpful, but it, they introduced us to, I think, I would say, the periphery of Marx's language
Yeah.
and, and his thoughts. Um, so we got an idea of where he was coming from, but Capital is actually where he lays out his entire argument and his entire deconstruction and examination of capital, like kernel by kernel, layer by layer,
Hmm.
by brick.
Yeah.
Um, and I wanted to make sure that I understood it, so that when I was engaging with other people and that when I was analyzing texts, that I was actually grounded um, in what this guy was actually talking about.
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely. Beautifully said. And I'm thinking about, when you were talking about like 2008, and this may be a segue into, yeah, thank you so much for sharing what you did. This may be a segue into kind of this first question that I have for you, because I immediately started thinking of like all the like, there's like multiple Lupe Fiasco tapes that like came out in 2008 and like
yep.
all his critiques, right? In the vein of hip hop, and so when I'm thinking about the intersection of poetry and capital, as a writer and a poet, whose stuff I absolutely love, how do you approach reading Capital, a book that's so rooted in economic theory and analysis? And do you find any poetic elements in his writing, or ways that his ideas lend themselves to creative interpretation for you?
Yeah. I mean, well, first I want to say, even though it's funny because Lupe, I don't know how I feel about him now, but if you had asked me 1 year ago, I still would have told you he's my favorite rapper,
Hmm.
just because of, I think, how he challenges himself, and he still challenges the form. Like, he'll
Hmm.
really be like, I want to see if I can get this out of rap. So let me see if I can write and record a whole album in 24
Hmm.
hours. And like,
Yeah.
he'll be like, I didn't do it, but I did do it in 3 days.
Yeah.
And before that, let me see what a song like Mural, like what that'll be. So Enemy of the State came out, I think like a year before I listened to it, but around the time that you're talking
Mm.
about. And I had just started union organizing, so I was like riding around, definitely like slapping that in my really crappy Corolla. Um, as far as the poetics of Marx, so I mean, to me, man, the thing about Capital is I think it looks like a very intimidating book. You look at the thing and it's just
Mm,
like dumbass big,
hmm.
it looks like an ugly
Hell bit.
fish. It's hella big, right? It's like, why, bro? Why? Its reputation also is like, not maybe the funnest book to read at times,
Huh.
but there's a reason why the book is the length that it is. Um, but it is poetic
Mm,
because one task that's available to poetry, really to all art, but a task that I actually try to shoot for in my own poetry is to be able to derealize people of something. So to take something that people believe that they have, that they would assume they're overly familiar with, you
sure.
know, like the air that they walk around in, the
Mm,
house that they live in, the streets that they take going to work each day, and to be able to adjust their perspective of it by just taking out little pieces here, here, and here, and here, and here. And suddenly they realize that they are looking at a completely different thing
mm,
that is creating the appearance of what they thought was a reality all along.
yeah.
And so to me that's a work of poetry. The very first thing he does is I mean, it's funny in a way because it's like you come to this book and it's like, Marx, I want you to fucking give me that communist manifesto shit, brother. Like, I want you to tell me about the chains, bro. Like, tell me how we got to lose those motherfuckers, man. Tell us how to get free. And he's like, okay, first thing we're going to talk about is, yeah, we live in a world of commodities. So let's, what does that mean? So let's go to the
Yeah.
grocery store, let's go to the market, and he just slowly breaks down like what is a commodity? What are
Yeah.
like the different elements of a commodity? How did that come to be? What are the
Mm,
implications of suddenly like switching from how people maybe just produce things for their own use to now producing things for commodity production? And then how does that relate to the development of money itself? And what is
mm,
money measuring? So he starts all the way back there to be able to slowly build his argument. And as he's doing this, you realize like all this stuff that I just kind of thought was, I took for granted. I thought was just
sure.
maybe just what you would naturally get as a society develops, just part and parcel of human development. All of
Hmm.
this stuff actually is contingent upon this specific mode of production
Yep.
that in itself is contingent upon these small little dynamics, like maybe the constant chaos that is happening at the core of a cell,
Hmm.
move around constantly, like little explosions that that are only able to not completely rupture and die by displacing their contradictions on slightly bigger cells that also have little explosions inside of them that can only sustain themselves, so on and so forth, right? But those
Mm,
things are their commodities, their their money, their all these other things that you thought were just like stable, static objects. And he's like, no,
yep.
these things actually have inner relationships within themselves that are unstable.
Yep.
And when these things are loosed upon the world, they create additional ruptures that further destabilize the world around them. And that destabilization is only resolved by, so on and so forth, right? Creating blah,
Yep.
blah, blah, right? So to
Man, what a
me,
breakdown.
yeah, like that is poetic because if you if you don't start there, you just think you're living in a world that's standing still, and you think like everything around you just is the way that it is, and movement happens vaguely somewhere above you, maybe in the halls of government, what have you. But you realize there's movement all around you, and you perk up, and you can't really see the structure around you the same way again.
Man, I really love like the connection you make around like the work of poetry being, in a lot of ways like aiming to help people, like you said, derealize or like uncover, right? Explore pieces that, like we've maybe consciously or unconsciously accepted as just like reality, even maybe not even ever even considered or thought about. Um, the question coming to mind, I guess, is like, I'd love to know any thoughts that you might have on what does it mean then too for like, for artists and writers, poets, maybe specifically, like, to, to be pushed and pulled, right, to be thinking about, the commodification of your art.
I mean, I don't know. I think, well, the first thing that comes to mind, I don't know if this is immediately appropriate, but uh, part of the reason that, like, I think one of the reasons that I kept working in poetry is because I was like, this is a medium that really does not matter commercially. So
Hmm.
like I have a lot of room to just like really be myself. Like clearly I'm a special type of guy. So I can be all that weirdness here, and there's not very many compromises that I would need to make
Uh,
in the name of commerce
mhm,
and commodification.
mhm.
Um, so I think it also depends on what the aim of your art is, what you get out of making art, and why you make it. I've known artists of a lot of different types, right? Like
Sure.
artists, just get who are really, really talented, but just get pleasure out of just like, this is just for me. Like, I like it. Maybe I'm gonna sell this beat. Maybe I'm just gonna like be happy that I made it.
Hmm.
And I've known other artists who are like, I need to make money off of this. Like, I need to feed my family off of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's going to affect my decision making. And so I'm not in a place, I think, to really, um, well, am I answering the question? You know?
Yeah. Oh, totally. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. I said any thoughts that come to mind, so I appreciate it.
Yeah. I just, I think suggesting that people even have clarity on what their task is probably even too much to ask in this day and age? So,
Hmm.
but, um, if there are artists who fall into the tradition that I have, I imagine that that's necessary to at least just be clear. And at the same time, then like you don't have to make any sacrifices on my behalf. This world's
Hmm.
hard. This
Hmm.
world's impossibly hard, right?
Hmm.
So I don't think anything has to be anything.
Hmm.
Um, if you have to serve empire, though, if you have to do something like justify genocide,
Hmm.
if you willingly compromise and silence, like, on behalf of Israel or like sacrifice your relationships, then, I don't have to walk in those shoes. So I don't know, but I would say from the shoes that I'm walking in, that feels pretty detestable. Uh,
Hmm. Yep.
yeah,
Agreed.
you know what I mean? So yeah, and let's stop here and just off top, like free Gaza, free Palestine,
Absolutely.
off
Free
top.
Palestine all day.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, so what's coming to mind right now too is I was kind of talking about, and I don't want to sound overly critical, but how there was just this at the time, and maybe even still now, this sort of vague I keep calling it vague, but this general anti-capitalist sentiment that, and maybe it's me because I still have to say that there's a lot more reading that I look forward to engaging in.
Hmm.
Uh, I still have a lot of sharpening of my own analytical tools and knowledge base to do, but some of it is in fact because like people haven't engaged with this text or other basics.
Yeah.
Part of the reason why I say that is like when you go back and you read the words of like George Jackson, when you go listen to the old Panthers,
Hmm.
uh, those motherfuckers are pretty clear in what parts of like specifically Marx or anybody else's analysis
Yeah,
that they are taking and relating immediately to how they are engaging with struggle on the ground or uh, yeah, how they are addressing the on the ground conditions
absolutely.
in their movement, right? Like that. And so that is something that I do think is very, very different. Um,
Mm,
that many of the people that maybe have access to actually reading Capital are probably trapped within academia because that
sure,
is a place where people have the actual time and energy,
exactly.
which is at a premium, like you talked about, to be able to do that.
Hmm.
Um, and I think another thing that you mentioned in this podcast is just how we have to be real about what is happening to our capacity to read as a country,
Hmm.
which feels like embarrassing to discuss, right?
Yeah.
Especially, we're all like, we're adults. Like, what? No, of course I can read. You can't read, but it's like we
Mm,
have another part of what's unique about this time are these completely unanticipated but grossly powerful things that pull at our attention and are
yep.
freely available and unregulated pretty much uh,
Hmm.
24/7.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and they're not just deployed for pleasure, but they also are deployed for work as well and can creep into our time of work. So, um,
1000%.
yeah, so I think I took us pretty far off topic, but
No, no, no. I love it. And I guess one thing maybe I'll say before, I ask you, maybe shift gears a little bit and ask you another question is, um, a couple things came to mind just as far as, yeah, I mean, like, we've talked, numerous times about Chris Hedges' book, Empire of Illusion, and the end of literacy, the triumph of spectacle, right? And like, and how, he doesn't just, come out of nowhere with it, right? Like he cites all these different people, but, just like really prophetic as far as the relationship between, a critical mass of a society's ability to engage with, uh, with critical literacy,
yeah,
and its relationship specifically to like the less kind of literate a society becomes, the more prone it is to falling victim to fascism, losing your civil rights, human rights,
yeah,
and just like seeing that over time. And I think you said something really, it stuck with me a long, long time ago, just like about our love for The Simpsons, where just like you said something to the effect of, this is not exactly, it, but you said something to the effect of like, Matt Groening and The Simpsons does this beautiful job of, like showing people who like understand that they're oppressed, but like are, struggling or like have given up on like figuring out how to like resist it. And just like, that, yeah, that real American ire of like I know that all these systems are like dehumanizing and horrific, and like I just don't know what to do about it. And like and wrestling, against that nihilism, right? Um, and I forgot my other thought, but if it comes back, then I'll speak to it. But I want to shift gears a little bit and kind of talk about kind of relevance to modern day labor movements. Um, feel free to talk about Luigi here if you'd like to. But from your experiences as a labor organizer, what parts of capital feel the most relevant to today's labor struggles? I'm wondering if there's also particular concepts or critiques by Marx you see coming to life in contemporary workplaces. And then the third piece is like what might be missing from his lens as far as like being European, being a white man, particularly as it pertains to BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and or person of color proletariat experiences.
yeah. Um, so a quick bit about Hedges since you brought him up. Hedges, that's the man.
Mhm.
And probably
Hey,
one of
hey, why? Sorry to interrupt. Why Aki, my brother, called him the white immortal technique.
Jesus Christ. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
I mean, when you think about what that dude's been through, he is just like a walking dance with the devil, just nonstop. Like
Hmm.
that's just it. I was bombed in Sarajevo. Yeah. But what Hedges said recently, and I'm just gonna quote him because I can't say it better than him, is that literacy is the thing that allows, he said entire societies, but I'll allow that, but I think also people to manage complex ideas.
Hmm.
Super important.
Yep.
Um, and also, it connects us to the great thinkers in the past. It allows us to remain in conversation with them. So
Hmm.
that's a critical function of literacy that we're in danger of losing.
Yep.
Um, as far as what I saw when I was a union organizer that is relevant to capital, I mean, so again, about capital is one of the reasons why it's so long is Marx spends time taking the appearance of things. Like there's this whole thing. If you so the first time I read Capital, I read it alongside David Harvey's A Companion to Capital, and so
Okay.
which is helpful. For anybody out there who wants to dive in it, just have one next to the other. And because it was the shutdown, Verso Books had the digital version on sale for like $1, so I took
Mm.
that. Uh, but Harvey pointed out like Marx uses the words like seems or in some editions like appears so often because what he is doing is he wants to draw attention to the glamour that is placed over the actual dynamic that gives rise to the glamour and how the
Hmm.
dynamic is something that is one in motion and it's in motion intersecting with other things and how that is something that in most cases is like severely damaging. So I would say it's hard to it was difficult, I think, to talk to people about their wage relation. And I mean, I
Mm.
don't even think I had the tools to really have that discussion, but by and large, you talk to an American about what they're getting paid, and
Yeah.
people feel like, well, I'm getting paid a fair wage for what I work, or I would say over the past 7 years, 8 years. Wait, no, it's 2024. God. Uh yeah, let's say around 2014, 2015, it shifted, and now people will be, I'm a little bit underpaid. I'm a little bit underpaid.
Mm. Interesting.
Because people feel that your wages are actually just a reflection of how important your job is, you know? And it's like,
Mm.
well, yeah, all I do is answer phones at a call center. It's like anybody could do this, you know? Yeah, all I do is well, I drive people around, like anybody could do this. And they think that we're taught that.
Mm.
Everybody's taught that. The adults that you grow up under tell you that. Like that's what your
Exactly.
paycheck is. It's a fee for a service, whatever, right? Whereas actually, again, what's dope about capital is like Marx. Okay, so there's the slogan that we say. It's like workers create the worth, like workers create the wealth. And we'll say that slogan at protests. We'll do whatever. We'll shout it. Capital actually does the work line by line to point out,
Mm.
no, actually, literally, like when money is created to actually be able to quantify the average amount of labor that went into producing a product.
Yeah.
So that is all that money exists to measure. So everything that is uh, everything is internal.
Mm.
And when you work for somebody, what's actually being done by the person who employs you is your wages are partially what they estimate that you need to be able to come back like the next day so that you don't completely die.
Mm.
Everything else that they don't pay you is for them to keep
Yep.
so that they can continue to turn a profit, right? And
Hmm.
they will do everything that they can to intensify your work, to make you work longer, to commit wage theft, all these other little techniques, so that what you generate for the company continues to further enrich them,
Yeah.
right? So, but it's hard to have that discussion with people,
Very, very hard.
because it's also, I mean, the glamour is also a house of cards. So
Hmm.
if you were to take that away from somebody, what else does it mean about the country that they've grown up in, or what else does it mean about
Yeah.
what their parents told them about working hard in order to get ahead? You know,
Hmm.
what they were taught about how hard their grandparents worked to be able to afford, the house that they bought, uh,
Yeah.
just by clocking in and out every single day. So,
Hmm.
but those things are relevant. And also obviously class consciousness. Um, America fetishizes its own alienation now, in particular. I mean, it was, the rugged individual was always heading that direction. But you have all these ways to confuse yourself into believing that you are having a completely singular experience. And even if the phenomena of that experience in some ways like resemble what's going on with the person who works to the left of you and the person that works to the right of you and the person down the hall and
Hmm.
down the hall that way, uh, there's no way that you all can be lumped together into, let's say, like a class of people that
Uh-huh.
are experiencing those phenomena, because
Hmm.
there is a straightforward tendency that is at work, that has been at work for, a very, very long time. Instead, people personalize their own workplace, and what people believe is that, well, my boss wouldn't do that,
Hmm.
because you work at most workplaces now, even mine. I can walk into my supervisor's office and just like, tell you what, man, today was a tough. And if you don't have, certain frameworks available to you, you confuse that for its own type of actual solidarity. You're not
Hmm.
able to prepare yourself for the fact that whenever need be, this person who actually represents management is always going to so on and so forth in the interest of the managerial class, in the interest of
Sure.
making sure that surplus labor is always generated and exploited, uh, to the nth degree and forward. So
Hmm.
those things are difficult, in this country. And as far as what Marx couldn't anticipate, I don't think he could have anticipated. I mean, what I love about being black is it's just history couldn't have anticipated this, you know? Um, I still view blackness as being and I'm not alone in this, but like the principal anti-capitalist marker, because we
Hmm.
we didn't die. We didn't die, but we actually are the source of what created, I mean, the biggest, like the realization of capitalism, and thus hell on earth. And
Hmm.
we survived it, right? Like we
Wow.
were the ultimate surplus value, because it was all exploitation. There were no wages that had to be paid to sustain us to
Hmm.
come back at the end of the week. There was no figuring in that. It was just like,
Yeah.
this is pure work. And
Hmm.
you can treat them like chattel. You can breed them, all this type of stuff. And in order to do that, I mean, you had to treat these people as, as animal. You had to literally do Frankenstein like experiments into the inhumane. I
Hmm.
mean, it's like the a poetics of terror
Yeah.
to was visited upon and part of the creation of Black people, and we survived it.
Hmm.
And because we survived it, though, and because that still has never been reckoned with properly, exactly what that means, we are always, no matter like which Negroes want to assimilate, which Negroes want to, sing and dance and shit, like we are always gonna remain, I think, forever in tension with capitalism. I think, some very distressing signs have occurred uh recently, but I still do believe that like black people are the natural anti-capitalist class because
Mm,
blackness was, above all else, blackness was created to be a marker
mm,
that uh, that it decided what these people's relationship to a particular means of production was going to be. And then what resulted from that, once that particular mode of
mm.
production was gone, was then just a bunch more unholiness and terror and continued oppression was visited upon these people for, all the reasons we don't have to get into, but um, and we still persist. And so our bodies,
Mm,
our health, our communities, our ways of speaking, our ways of recognizing, our ways of metabolizing through the centuries, they all hold all of that. It's all still
yeah,
there in us.
yeah.
Um, yeah. So, and Marx, I don't know. Like, I don't think Marx could anticipate that. I don't think anybody could anticipate.
Agreed, 1,000%. And I think, a few different, I mean, a lot of like, I don't necessarily have my own, I don't know, I'm just like noticing in the moment. I never rarely have like my own like wisdom. I'm just like, hey, da da da, and I say something smart. Generally, it's like I go back to like things that I've heard people say and things that I've read. But the couple or three things that came to mind was like Scott Kurashige, who says, that like he calls anti-blackness, anti-black racism the fulcrum of white supremacy, right? And like thinking about white supremacy's, just completely interwoven, kind of tapestry with capitalism. Um, and then Cornel West, who says like, he says specifically like when white people see black people, and I would argue when non-black people see black people, like they should give them a standing ovation. Um, and then the last kind of thought was like going back to I think what you were saying, like I think you were referencing like I think you said George Jackson. I was thinking about like the Black Panther Party. I was thinking about Malcolm, but just like in thinking about what have been the attacks that have happened around cutting specifically like working BIPOC folks off from accessing literacy, right? Because like Malcolm, was like his voracious reader while incarcerated,
Mhm.
right? And like and just I don't know. I guess like where my mind is like this question. I'd be curious to hear any thoughts you have on it. Is like what do you perceive kind of has happened, maybe in our generation and the ones, after it around just like working class folks of color, and maybe specifically Black, having like these attacks on access to literacy and like high levels of it, because, you know, the folks were, not tied to these like ivory tower institutions and were, so like we're reading Fanon, we're reading Marx, but yeah, any thoughts that you might have on that?
Well, I mean, so sometimes I don't know how I feel about this train of thought, so I'll throw it out there just because in the moment, like it's coming up, I guess.
Please.
But and I can tie it to capital. Uh, I do wonder about maybe the wages of integration, right? Um, Obviously, the conditions of school were separate but equal, or separate but unequal.
Hmm.
But then what happens to Black teachers as we continue to move forward into you know, um, like homogeneity? Like,
Mhm.
how many Black teachers do we lose? How many white teachers start being put in charge of Black students' education? I mean, I know in my own experience, like white people act a fool. They can't handle Black children. I mean, like they're by and large, especially the further back you go, like raised to treat them very poorly, to react very poorly to their presence,
Mhm.
fear, to detest them. So what did that do just in terms of how these children were like punished and began to be turned away from the classroom and be turned off of literacy?
Mhm.
Then obviously then you think about how schools are funded by like a tax base, right? And so when that happens, then like whose communities are well funded and then whose communities are not, the impacts of that. What other supportive institutions that a well-funded community has access to that a community that has like a more depleted tax base does not, and what happens to the youth in that community. So I would say all of those things. I mean,
Mhm. Yeah.
even in my own experience, I'm like lucky. I'm one of the luckiest Black people that I know, and I still remember my parents having to intervene at public school because I had a teacher who was just a racist and who
Mhm.
was trying to just put me in sped. And
Mhm.
so, and made me like I had to keep testing. I remember this one point in first grade because she wanted me out of her classroom
Mhm.
because I could already read like I read way better than the other kids, so I would be really
Yeah.
bored, all this other stuff. I was
Sure.
disruptive though, and the only way that she could understand that was like, well, put him in sped. And luckily, I had the resources of two parents, one of whom didn't have to work, who could then actually advocate for me and stuff like that. So,
Mhm.
um, yeah, I mean, I grew up in a household where I was taught that literacy was fundamental to the liberation of Black people. And that's another thing that, yeah, I mean, it's part of my spine, like it's part of my character. So
Mhm.
I can't really get away from that. And I so yeah, I mean, removing that tradition from Black people, I think, or trying to do it, or the ways that that has been subverted, uh, is catastrophic
Mhm.
and also very convenient. And I would imagine if you had a man like J. Edgar Hoover, um, was the head of FBI. I mean, I don't think like these things always amount to coincidences.
1,000%. Absolutely.
So
Um, I want to thank you so much for sharing that. And I think this is like a nice segue. I actually want to jump into kind of talking about the role of storytelling in class liberation. Because I think, you're just a brilliant storyteller, and, you're kind of already doing some of kind of like what, these questions, are kind of moving towards. But, Marx is this, profound storyteller in his own right, as you kind of noted. And the language he uses to critique capitalism, like you even began with talking about like let's go to the grocery store. um, and I'm wondering, do you see storytelling, perhaps poetry, as tools for economic class liberation? How might they amplify core messages of capital for today's audience, and what might that look like in your art, your vocation, your internal processes, etc.?
yeah, I mean, so I mean, one funny thing about capital is like anything, when something has like different elements, you can't kind of separate it and be like, well, he could have done this without that, right? So a funny thing about capital is that he like is constantly referencing like poetry and plays,
Mhm.
and he's like finding interviews with people and stuff like that. Like it's not just, and I like, if I have the ability to encourage anybody to do anything, it would be, well, not just read Capital, probably do something cool. But uh if I could get that across, like Capital's not just super dry and like he's like, here are my charts and graphs, and then here are the
Mm.
charts and graphs of the competitors, and like he's constantly using other mediums to be able to get his point across because that's necessary.
Mm.
Because in the end, he's pointing out that we live inside of a huge fucking mystification. There are
Mm.
things that move people. Like
Mm.
we set into motion something that actually is like super trippy. And
Mm.
sometimes the only like you like that's what he's trying to get. One of the things he's trying to get people to come to term with is like, yeah, no, like this thing actually, it's really a brain breaker. And
Yeah.
sometimes to be able to get that across, like you do have to evoke poetry. You do have to evoke the finest of prose. You do have to you may have to get dramaturgical with it. I mean,
Mm.
even the opening of Capital. So I anybody who like knows me knows I grew up doing theater, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's actually my formative artistic training, like
Mm.
real working class, like genius black actors giving
Mm.
me the game from the time that I was young. So dramaturgy is kind of my foundation for reading. The opening of Capital is almost like curtains up on a play. And
Okay.
Marx is like an impish character, you know, coming to center stage and being like, well, it appears that the blah, 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 but we're going to blah, and away we go, you know? I mean, it's,
I love that.
yeah, that's how I see it, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
He's also like
yeah.
laughing at people like all throughout the shit. He's hella making fun of people. He like disses people so fucking hard all the time, you know? Like it's not the
Uh,
funniest because it's written like it's translated German from like forever ago. So like I'm not
mm.
saying you're gonna like bust up laughing, but
Sure. Yeah, yeah,
if you can see it in its own context, like he takes swings at people. Like he had
yeah.
hatred for people and like put it in this
Absolutely.
massively popular book. That's the only way some people are ever going to be heard of is like Marx is calling them stupid as fuck. Like
Wow.
that's raw. That's raw as
That's
shit.
that's wow. I love it.
So, um, so calm myself down.
No,
Uh,
I love it.
I I think another reason why capital is important to me
Mm.
is I want, and it's not just like reading capital and being like, good, I'm smart, but
Mm.
in general, I want to be able to see the world as clearly as possible. And that
Mm.
takes a couple of things. It's not just reading a book, but it's also the work that I've done outside of the book is being able to be a companion alongside people
Mm-hmm.
for years and years and years now, to be able to sit with people in
Yeah.
desperate, quiet moments and just to learn how to listen and receive their own story on their own terms and to like then just in my own head kind of map that on to what I think I know from reading books, see how these things fit together, but also just learn more about people
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah.
that when I reflect the world through my writing, and this is, what I would hope for any other writer or any other person making art, is that there is an alignment that Marx also demonstrates in how he writes, but there's an alignment from top to bottom when you are putting things out because
Mm.
when you write stories when I write poems, I think people can relate to a lot of times it's like how did I put it? It's like trying to like I mean it's like trying to ride a Ouija board,
Hmm.
write down a Ouija board. It's just it's you have some control, but it's gonna come out how it's gonna come out because it's arranged inside of you in this particular way.
Mm.
And part of the only control that you have is what you've put inside of yourself and all the practice that you've put into your craft.
Yeah.
But when it's time for the thing to come out, it's a lot of times it's going to come out how it's going to come out. You can do some editing, you can do some revising, but sometimes it's not going to move any more than it can. Like sometimes you're just like, I'll make something and it's like, it's not going to move. I was able to bend it like, it ain't bending.
Mm, yeah,
You know?
yeah.
And so in in that work of developing an analysis and checking your analysis and then being in solidarity with people in the world, hopefully when it comes out, it is in alignment with your analysis and also with who you think is necessary and what art you think is necessary in this world.
Mm, man, thank you so much. I appreciate you sharing that. Um, just because of time, I got to skip over, a couple of things, but um, I wanted to, go to imagining post-capitalism, right? And so keeping in mind that I believe I could be wrong, and I'll be mad at myself if I'm wrong, but I believe it was Henry Giroux who said it's easier for most people to imagine the end of the world than it is for them to imagine the end of capitalism. So, kind of keeping that in mind, Marx's work in Capital lays the groundwork for critiquing capitalism, but leaves open questions about what comes next. And wondering, in your work, in your life, in your mind, how do you imagine post-capitalist possibilities for society, especially in terms of labor, welfare, creative arts, anything else beyond that?
Um,
And just to
sure.
clarify, I don't expect you to have the answers for how we yeah we get there.
I mean, yeah, big question. I still suspect that the fall of capitalism is so far away that if a
Mm,
recording of me trying to imagine it and talk about it survives, it would be worth a little bit of money and laughter. Um, this thing is not going down without a fight,
yeah.
and um, many people, myself included, I will implicate just myself and anybody who feels like me, feel free to join me in this feeling, but like myself have not been giving it the fight that I should be giving it.
Mm,
Um, but I think what is possible and I think what is doable and I think what is important right now actually um and maybe not because I say this idea a lot and then it's like people are just like whatever. But I think putting the lie to capitalism directly, putting, yeah, by creating systems that demonstrate how it fails to meet people's basic needs.
yeah.
And fortunately, I mean, not really fortunately, because the fact that this is happening actually means that we've been in a crisis for a very long time. But this
Mm,
is happening with, I mean, like, I think Community Ready Corps out in Oakland. Um, there's the other organization with Abbas, but like they're doing medical clinics in Oakland. So people are forming their own independent organizations
yeah.
because it's just like it's too hard to get healthcare in this country, and especially if you are on the are on the complete margin. So we've got to figure out how to do it for ourselves.
Mm,
It's too hard for too many people to actually afford fresh food regularly. So we got to figure out how to actually build um, networks and co-ops so that we can do this for ourselves. But if we're able to, I think about being able to scale these things or even, yeah, to scale these things so that we can reintroduce to one another that we actually are able to take care of one another.
mm,
Um, I think there are problems with that idea, just thinking about it, because one thing that also Marx points out in Capital, which, what we see is that capital also, the many things that it breaks people of is the ability to reproduce their own subsistence so that they are more increasingly more dependent on the market for whatever they need so that they have
mhm,
to commodities, right? Um, and so, by and large, most people are stuck in that position. But
mhm,
but I do think that's I do think that's one thing.
Mm,
Uh, the other thing is kind of like uh, what this thing that I'm writing is about is I think the idea of the self right now, the idea of me, the idea of a me, and the idea, yeah, is it's vastly different than it's ever been. I think it needs to go. I think it's doing a lot of damage. I think it has us very, very confused. Um, I think that I've been thinking that most recently because I've been reading Carlo Rovelli, uh, quantum mechanics guy,
mm,
and his interpretation of uh, of quantum mechanics is really interesting to me because what he believes is that all of the different little like particles that make up the universe, it's not so much that they have their own properties that are like that, whether or not they do anything. It's that they just express those properties whenever they come into contact with something, right?
mm,
And outside of that, they're nothing.
hmm.
And that made me think about people because this
Yeah.
is also similar to something that like in the Buddhist tradition that I don't know about, but my brother who lives in Hawaii and studies it, he immediately knew. He was like, "This is a guy from blah blah blah." But when do you really show up as you, as
Hmm.
a human? Is it when you put on the clothes that you plan to wear, that you bought, that your commoditized, pre-thought out lunch, your specific caloric diet, your super, your car, your dream car that you thought about? Like, is that when you're making sure you're listening to your specific playlist that represents you as a person on the Thursday when you're mad at your boss and when you want to ignore people in the special way so if they ask what you're listening to, like, is that you? Or
Mm,
are you when you brush against somebody and you're able to make the choice to impact them in a positive way? Like, is that when you actually show up? Or do you think you only show up in this super heavily commoditized, pre-planned way? Like on your social media, in your own comment section whenever you post a video and you hoping that it gets so deep it's like a well that people fall down like trying to just see
mm,
how deep the adoration for your commodified image goes,
hmm.
or is really the only time you actually show up when you brush up against nature, when you brush up against your neighbor, when you brush up against your lover, children, somebody else out? And that's the direction I think we need to go in, is that
Yeah.
we're fooled into thinking that we have a self that is based on a bunch of stuff that we can grab and hold on to when that is nothing actually.
Yeah.
The only time we show up is in each other's lives, and what makes humans
Um,
special is we have a consciousness that allows us to choose a wide array of ways to respond to those brushes up against one another
yeah.
and nature, which we're supposed to be stewards of.
Yeah. Man, that's so beautifully said. Immediately makes me think of, I feel, incredibly fortunate in that both explicitly and implicitly from the time I was very, very young, that, my parents instilled in me, this idea that, nothing matters more than one's relationships.
Mm.
Um, and then, as I got a little older, my mother being like really explicitly communicating, um, nothing matters more than your relationships because these systems are collapsing. And when, all these things that we kind of, like you were saying in the very beginning of our conversation, like we take for granted, are like power grid is down. It's like who can you tap in with, where, you'll be able to continue to have access to the things that will keep you alive. Um, and and just I don't know, just this element around just like, knowing that human beings are hardwired for connection and all the different ways, right? We didn't get to go into it too much, right? But just like, with regards to, all the themes around alienation, right? And just like how uh how disposable people regularly feel and lonely, and how much of a battle it is, for folks to, and and how on purpose that is through these systems to, to try to interrupt any form of kind of class solidarity. But yeah, but I just, I'm so grateful for our time together, for, our friendship. And I got a couple questions to close out. And the first is, what is a song, musical artist, and or album you would pair with this book? And then the second is just why would you recommend that folks read Capital, Das Kapital by Karl Marx?
Man, I just feel like I'm gonna say the cliche thing. So just because like I have to because I'm Sacramento till the death of me, I'm gonna
They
say C plus Viernes Negro Cuatro. Like that's the album that I'm gonna choose.
okay.
Um, you could say all of Kendrick's disses because they accomplished changing the way that people see Drake, which is very powerful.
Indeed,
And capital
indeed.
does change the way that you see the world you live in. But C
Mm,
plus Viernes Negro Cuatro, that's the shit.
Surely. And why would you recommend that folks read Capital by Karl Marx?
Um,
And you've
I
already spoken a lot to this, but
yeah, I mean, um, I want to stress that this is not a standard like economic textbook or like math textbook that they would give you in the confines of a classroom where
hmm
you open it up and then suddenly you're confronted with, well, if you didn't read blah, 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 you're shit out of luck. Or if you're not familiar
mm,
with this particular law of the blah, 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 then you're not going to get it. Um, Marx takes his time to help you build into how he is thinking about these things. Uh, he's not cuddly with it. That type of writing didn't exist then, where he's like, come on, all right, now pointing things out like that's, wasn't the style at the time. You had an onion on your belt. But if you take your time with it, he's showing you the techniques that you need to be able to think about things in this particular way. And along the way, if you stick with it, what you will have are is a scientific examination of capitalism, how it actually works,
hmm
and why it is dysfunctional, and the
hmm
many ways that it creates further dysfunction in wherever it's planted and how it's
hmm
done this throughout history. So it's a work of history, it's a work of theory, it's a work of philosophy, but above all he insists on it being able to stand up to scientific rigor. That's why the book is so long. It's not just him talking, it's because he wants to make his arguments, you know, um, tight, 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 with the
mm,
proof of a logician. And
yeah.
so I think people of a certain tendency, I think that is very valuable for us to have, more
hmm
valuable than, again, just a general sentiment.
hmm
If you were raised in a tradition where you believe the only people who fought for you were the revolutionaries, the only people who dreamed about you being where you are now and safe and having whatever kind of, something uh, similar to the life that you have now, were the people back then who were really giving it up. They are of this tradition and um, they left this work here for us to pick up.
mm.
So for me, I'm not doing direct action anymore. My old ass ain't organizing. But I can pick up a book. I can join them in this work. And the last thing, okay, sorry,
No,
sorry.
no apologies necessary.
I wanted to connect this to Tony Cade Bambara,
Okay.
Education of a Storyteller, right?
hmm
So people probably know this, but uh, doctors Blake and Iwanide made sure that I read this. But so this little girl, she comes home from her school and she tells her grandma, like, I know what E equals MC squared means. She tells her all these things she's learned at her school, and her grandma's like, what does that mean? And the bright little girl explains it, but she's not able to explain it in any other terms than how it's explained in the classroom.
Mm,
And the moral of this short story is that it's asking, do you really know anything if you don't know it within community? And that's the task for us. So um, these things need to be known in a cohort among us. It needs to be shared and discussed among us, not in isolation, kind of the way that like I'm doing it, but like among family members, so that we can then do
mm,
sort of fun like problem work of like figuring out how to make jokes out of it with our young ones as
mm,
we start to raise them, like that is actually part of the task. And we can do that. We can do that together.
mm.
Um, and that's why we should read Capital.
For sure, man. Um, YD Hawkins, it has been such a pleasure. I love your heart. I love your mind. I love how visionary you are. And thank you for all the inspiration and for your time today. That is our time. Thank you all so, so much for tuning in to the Paper Plane podcast, and we will see you next time. Peace.